think just that there are always going to be people mobilizing to provide support and resources for immigrant New Yorkers. Right. So whether that's in like 1840s, 50s, or today. And as a historian, yeah, sometimes it's tough to find a neat and tidy conclusion to the exhibition because sometimes we see some of the same things happening over and over. But I find that I can always take comfort in the idea that with each generation, there are activists.
That was Sarah Seidman, the curator of social activism at the Museum of the City of New York. And this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. Despite being celebrated as the nation's quintessential city of immigrants, New York City is grappling with a surge of anti-immigrant sentiment. From Mayor Eric Adams attributing budget cuts to the influx of migrants, to persistent narratives blaming newcomers for societal woes, xenophobic rhetoric is alarmingly pervasive, even here. But why does this sentiment persist in a city built by generations of immigrants? To help unpack this complex issue, I spoke to Sarah Seidman. Remember, she's the curator of social activism at the Museum of the City of New York. Sarah has curated the exhibit Nativists and Immigrants, Beware of Foreign Influence, 1830 to 1860, which explores the deep roots of anti-immigrant movements in New York's history. Today, Sarah shares historical patterns of xenophobia that continue to influence modern attitudes. She also explains why disproven myths about immigrants endure and what lessons we can learn from the past to build a more inclusive future. Before we jump in, a quick message from our team.
Hi, I'm Mariana from the Epicenter NYC team. Did you know that anxiety, sleep problems, and muscle pain could be symptoms of long COVID? Take the steps needed to protect yourself, your family, and your plants. Get vaccinated against COVID-19. We can help you schedule your appointment and even arrange your ride there. Email us at hello@epicenter-nyc.com or call or text us at 917-818-2690.
Now back to the show. Here's my conversation with Sarah Seidman.
I'm Sarah Seidman, the Puffin Foundation Curator of Social Activism at the Museum of the City of New York.
As you may know, I'm reporting on the history of recently resurrected political narratives of immigrants taking jobs from other marginalized groups. And one of the people I reached out to, a political scientist, referred me to your ongoing Nativists and Immigrants exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York to help understand where some of that comes from. Could you speak a little bit about your role with this exhibit and the larger Activist New York exhibition and what inspired it in the first place?
Sure. So Activist New York actually opened in 2012. So we're in like our 12th, 13th year, I guess, at this point. And actually the exhibition predates my arrival at the museum. So I can certainly talk about how it came to be. And then I came on board like 2 years later. The show was like a partnership, like a collaboration between the family-run Puffin Foundation, who approached the museum about doing something on activism. And then, after much discussion and huddling with a group of advisors, Activist New York opened in May 2012, but it was always supposed to be ongoing. And so that's, it was guest curated by a colleague of mine in the public history field, Stephen Jaffe, and Sarah Henry, who's the chief curator at the Museum of the City of New York. And since it was always meant to be ongoing and change, like activism itself, they brought me on 2 years later to oversee its evolution.
Got it. So then the section, or I don't know if I can call it an exhibit, Nativists and Immigrants, was that added later on, or was that there from the start?
That was part of the original show, and there are just a handful that we never plan on taking out because they're just so important to New York City history. But we've made a lot of changes to it over time, just at the object level, because for history shows, it's so hard to keep things on view for years and years at a time when you have historical artifacts. So we're frequently doing object rotations in the gallery for conservation reasons, like at least twice a year. It used to be even more than that.
Could you speak about some of those objects?
So this section really looks at 19th century xenophobia or anti-immigrant organizing in New York City. And we make, a clear point in the exhibition, in the introduction to it, that we approach activism across the political spectrum. Whether we personally agree with some of these actions or not, that the show and our definition of activism is really about New Yorkers mobilizing around issues that they believe in, sometimes coming together and sometimes clashing. So this section really focuses on anti-immigrant organizing in terms of anti-Irish Catholic and German Catholic waves of immigrants in the mid-19th century. And then we also touch on Chinese exclusion laws and treatment of Chinese immigrants in New York, which we also then follow up on in a later section about laundry workers in New York in the 1930s. So it kind of, the theme of immigration is really throughout the show, and it pops up here and there. We previously had an earlier section on Dutch settlements in New York and fights over who could stay in the new colony. Obviously, there were Lenape and indigenous inhabitants on the island before then. So right from the beginning, or even before the beginning, questions over who could be there. And then in the mid-19th century, as there are huge waves of immigrants coming in, escaping famine in Europe, basically with every wave of immigration, there's a wave of anti-immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment in New York City is what we see. So some of the objects that we have in the section we have a huge picture of a flag that was kind of an anti-immigrant flag. And it very oddly uses Native American as a term, even though we're talking about Anglo-American descendants of Anglo-American, of Anglo-immigrants, descendants of immigrants themselves, using that term Native American. And they were trying to prevent folks from voting until they had been in New York City for, I think, 21 years. We also have pictures of other anti-immigrant prominent figures in New York City, like James Harper of Harper's Magazine, HarperCollins. He and his brothers, formed a big publishing company, but he was elected mayor for 1 year only, in 1844, before he was ousted by voters again the following year. I was trying to dig into exactly how the election worked in 1844, but he definitely ran on barring immigrants from city jobs, which he might have been successful at. He tried to bar them from voting, which he was not successful at. The other piece of the exhibition section is really about how immigrant communities kind of came together to create their own institutions and resources. Some of the other objects are a coin to a theater on the Bowery that was very popular with German New Yorkers, or we have prints in our collection of some early Catholic schools in the city that were heavily opposed. So we see how immigrants mobilized in their own communities to create additional resources. And that's really what we focus on in this section as a response to this anti-immigrant sentiment.
Was there anything surprising in terms of just looking into some of these figures that were mentioned, like publisher James Harper that you mentioned and others in this exhibit?
For sure. I think people who have familiar names for other reasons, like Harper, or Morse is another one, like Morse code. He was also a very rapidly anti-immigrant figure who I think is quoted saying terrible things about immigrant New Yorkers. People who are innovative, maybe in other ways, be it publishing or scientific inventions, and then presenting very obviously what we think of as regressive anti-immigrant ideas. I think one other surprising thing, so the handbill I mentioned, the Immigrants' Lament, that's actually in the section next to nativists and immigrants in the slavery section. So the way Activist New York works, there's kind of 3 case studies that are facing each other and ideally in dialogue with each other. The show moves chronologically. And yeah, we want people to see how some of these different moments are connected. So the section on slavery has this handbill from our collection, which is both anti-slavery and anti-immigrant. And I think that was surprising to me, that it was a somewhat common train of political thought at that moment, a dual anti-slavery, also anti-immigrant sentiment. We see with the draft riots in the 1860s, recent immigrants like Irish immigrant New Yorkers were drafted in the Civil War, and that's who initiated, like who started rioting and targeted abolitionists and also African Americans in New York City, and in part because you could pay a fee of like $200 or $300. It was a lot of money to get out of the draft, which some people did, but these, new immigrants definitely couldn't afford that. And so the draft riots is a result of their violence around slavery. So I think that's also surprising and important, the connections, I think, there between immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment and slavery and abolitionism, all connected.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to the note you had made about the use of activists, just being a very open use for anyone who mobilizes towards a cause. Since it was mentioned in one of the display intros to describe Samuel Morse and James Harper, we both just spoke about, who blamed immigrants in the city for poverty and crime in slums. I was struck by that because the rest of the exhibition and popular use of the language around activism for social change calls to mind activism around more religious tolerance or any kind of tolerance, civil rights for marginalized communities, LGBTQ rights, economic justice, and so forth. So I think it's really important, especially in this moment where maybe in more recent times, like New York has been seen as such a blue and democratic stronghold, and that we're like maybe surprised when we see that kind of conservative activism. And it's good to remind ourselves of the history of it, and that there have been activism on both sides.
Yeah, and each of these case studies, I mean, they don't even have 2 sides necessarily. They have like multiple sides and multiple perspectives. So I think whether it's like the later section I mentioned on Chinese American laundry workers, many of whom had been in New York for generations, navigating discrimination as they tried to operate their laundries. Increasingly, they faced like citizenship requirements, which they didn't have citizenship because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it was a way to get them to go out of business, which they managed to organize and fight for. So I think within these, we see, anti-worker or anti-integration elements in many of the sections that we might categorize politically in certain ways. But, some of those folks who were leading the charge against integration of schools might have identified with, the Democratic Party. So I think we're also just trying to complicate, what those terms or poles of left and right even mean when we look at different moments of activism in the city. And there are other sections of the show that also feature, like the Liberal Party was present, in New York City, like moments where there were at least at the local level, more than 2 parties. It's interesting, for sure. But yeah, I think just like we think of New York as we're trying to complicate that idea of like a melting pot, then we're also trying to complicate the idea of it as just like a purely like liberal bastion.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if in your role you you get feedback or you hear responses from visitors. Because if you do, I'm curious about any of the most memorable or thoughtful responses you've received from visitors since you've been working on the exhibition, and specifically around nativists and activists, but also maybe some of the other exhibits or other sections, case studies it interacts with.
I think in 10 years of work on Activist New York, what I've heard the most is like, where is this topic, or where is my organization? And of course, we do take those seriously. I mean, one refrain we heard many times was, where's the history of disability rights in New York City? And so last year, we did put in a section, which certainly agreed that that's an important chapter, especially given our reliance on public transportation in New York and how inaccessible it is to folks who may not be, who use wheelchairs or other mobility devices. So that was an important addition that we made, but we had definitely received audience feedback, like asking about it. So I think that's the overriding, general audience feedback. We've also gotten a lot of teacher feedback, since Activist New York is our most popular field trip for students. And so our educators have a pretty formal mechanism for seeking feedback there. So we've heard, some really inspiring comments about how Activist New York helps their teaching or has changed their teaching at all grade levels. But I have also, I can remember one instance of someone commenting on how painful the section on nativists and immigrants was to them in a kind of triggering way. So I share that here because it's particularly relevant. And I think, we recognize that we present some very difficult histories, in the exhibition that can be difficult or painful to grapple with.
Yeah, I know you just spoke about the disability activism and how, some of that was in direct response to some of the feedback you were given. Do you think there'll be any other iterations or expansions planned? I know with nativists and immigrants, with that case study, apart from some objects that are being switched in and out, that will stay pretty much the same, or are there also plans to expand beyond that time period on the history of nativism and activism?
I think increasingly we are inclined to put in more recent objects into the case studies that are even historical. So I think the show has gotten a little bit more like that over time, whereas at the beginning we kept things really to the period that we were exploring. We're now, in an effort to connect past with present, we are more inclined to put an object in that goes beyond that period, but is a gesture to how it connects to today. So that could happen in that section. The other section in that area on vice and obscenity looks at really the Comstock laws, another piece of history that is extremely relevant right now, that talks about both contraception and abortion in New York in the 19th century, as well as things like the regulation of nudity on Broadway, like all kinds of different laws governing bodies, primarily women's bodies, in 19th century New York. And so we've increasingly put in objects in that section that are from more recent chapters in struggles around abortion rights and access in New York, whether it's the 70s. We just found all these T-shirts in our collection of from the 70s that speak to abortion, other women's rights slogans and things like that on these T-shirts, or to today. So yeah, I think stay tuned for that. And usually we've put in 1 or 2 new sections a year. We also now have a section on current events right at the front of the gallery, which is meant to be nimble and change. So stay tuned for that as well. But if there are things that people are looking for, we always also direct them to the website.
What are the most pressing messages and lessons that you hope New Yorkers would learn about immigration and nativism? But you feel free to speak about some of these other issues you mentioned, but particularly in this political moment.
I think just that there are always going to be people mobilizing to provide support and resources for immigrant New Yorkers, right? So whether that's in like 1840s, 50s, or today. And as a historian, sometimes it's tough to find a neat and tidy conclusion to the exhibition because sometimes we see some of the same things happening over and over. But I find that I can always take comfort in the idea that with each generation, there are activists mobilizing in solidarity, with other people or in their own communities. So I think that is a through line throughout the show, and certainly in the section on nativists and immigrants as well.
You can check out Nativists and Immigrants at 1220 Fifth Avenue, Monday to Friday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and on weekends from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. For more details, click the links in our show notes. This conversation is part of Epicenter NYC's coverage of underrepresented communities and issues around the 2024 elections. Check out our election site by visiting epicenter-nyc.com/election-2024. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at epicenter-nyc.com. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.